My name is Evelyn Ward, and for most of my life, people have described me with the same small, polite words: dependable, kind, steady. Words that sound like compliments until you realize they mean you've been invisible. I'm 68 years old, a retired librarian, widow turned wife again. And for more than 4 decades, I've lived in the same house on a quiet street where the lilac trees bloom every spring and the neighbors still wave from their porches. It's the sort of town that looks peaceful from the outside, the kind where everyone knows your name and pretends not to know your secrets. My days used to follow a rhythm so precise it could have been a hymn. Coffee at dawn, a slow walk through the garden, errands before noon, and a quiet dinner at the table with my husband, Richard. We married young, out of what we called love but was probably just survival. Over the years, we built a life out of patterns, birthdays, bills, holidays, forgiveness. From the outside, we must have looked solid, reliable, enviable even. But I've learned that stability and silence often look the same. Richard was once the kind of man who commanded attention without raising his voice. Charming, composed, respected in this small town. But charm is a dangerous thing. It ages badly. Beneath its shine, it hides ego, vanity, and a desperate need to be admired. I used to see only the surface. It took me a lifetime to understand what lay beneath. There's a stillness to this house now that feels different, not peaceful, not comforting, more like waiting. It's the kind of quiet that hums beneath the skin, that reminds you something is off even when you can't name it yet. I started feeling it months ago. Subtle thing. A new cologne, shirts I hadn't seen before, his phone always turned face down on the table. Little shifts in tone and timing that anyone else might dismiss. But women like me, we learn to hear what isn't said. At first, I did what I've always done. I made excuses. He was tired, stressed, forgetful. Men his age sometimes lose track of things, but excuses are soft lies, and I'd told myself too many over the years. One evening, while folding laundry, I found a hotel receipt tucked into his jacket pocket. Dinner for two, a room by the lake, expensive wine, the date printed in neat black ink. I stared at it until the numbers blurred. I remember sitting in the kitchen that night, long after he'd gone to bed, tracing the edges of that receipt with my finger. Proof doesn't always hurt right away. It lands quietly like dust, and only later do you realize how much has settled. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat there, breathing slowly, the clock ticking behind me, the refrigerator humming. The life I'd built, the man I'd trusted, had already started to rot long before that slip of paper. I was only now beginning to smell it. I began watching him after that, not as a wife but as an observer. There's a power in silence, in pretending not to know. I learned his patterns, the new routines he tried to hide behind. He thought he was clever, that I was too soft, too old, too small to notice. But invisibility has its uses. When no one's looking at you, you see everything. The worst part wasn't the affair itself. It was the ease of it. How seamlessly he moved between lives, between lies. The laughter at dinner, the practiced affection, the careful distance. Betrayal, I realized, doesn't come like thunder. It comes like fog, slow, patient. It wraps around you until you can't tell where you end and it begins. I found more signs: perfume on his jacket, credit card charges that didn't match his story, late-night phone calls that ended when I walked into the room. Each discovery chipped away at the last bit of innocence I had left. But still, I said nothing. Because I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. One night, I looked at his reflection in the dark window as he stood behind me. He looked older, worn, almost frightened of something unseen. I wondered what she gave him that I no longer could: excitement, flattery, the illusion of youth. Maybe he was just afraid of fading. Maybe we both were, but there was something different in me now, something calm and deliberate taking shape beneath the grief. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't rage. It was the slow, patient awakening of a woman who had been quiet for far too long. I didn't know then that his affair wasn't the worst of it. That the lies went deeper, darker, into places that would change everything I thought I knew about the man I shared my life with. but I could feel it coming, the crack in the calm, the tremor beneath the surface. And when it came, I would be ready. It's strange how quickly life rearranges itself once you learn a truth you can't unlearn. The world looks the same, but nothing feels familiar anymore. The morning after I found that hotel receipt, I stood in my kitchen like I'd never seen it before, the pale light filtering through the curtains, the same chipped mug, the same hum of the refrigerator. Yet beneath it all was a low vibration, a kind of quiet fury that hummed in my veins. I kept moving as if nothing had changed. Habit is a powerful disguise. I cooked breakfast, watered the plants, waved to neighbors on my morning walk. No one could tell that something inside me had split open. That's the advantage of being a woman my age. People stop looking closely long ago. They see the gray hair, the calm face, the polite smile, and assume there's no storm beneath it. But there was. I began to notice things I'd once ignored. His phone always tucked away, face down. The way he lingered outside before coming in, pausing in the driveway as if rehearsing his expression. His sudden generosity, flowers without reason, compliments that didn't fit. The guilt in his gestures was so transparent it became insulting. One afternoon while he was showering, I checked the pockets of his trousers, something I hadn't done in years. There, folded neatly, was another receipt. This one wasn't from a hotel, it was from a pharmacy. Prenatal vitamins. My heart didn't race, it just slowed. Like time itself decided to hold its breath. The betrayal had been silent before, distant. But this was tangible, proof of something deeper, something reckless. He wasn't just unfaithful, he was entangled. That night I lay beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. It struck me that I didn't really know the man lying next to me. I knew his habits, his routines, his voice in the dark, but not his mind, not anymore. Maybe I never had. He shifted in his sleep and murmured something, a name I didn't recognize. I watched the ceiling until morning. The next day I followed the clue. I drove into town, parked near the pharmacy, and waited. I knew the cashier, a sweet girl who used to come into the library where I worked before I retired. I told her I was looking for a brand of vitamins my doctor had mentioned. She smiled, unaware of the storm behind my words. When she brought them out, I asked casually if she sold many. She nodded and said, without meaning anything by it, that she'd just sold a few bottles last week to a man named Richard Ward, my husband. It's strange how calm truth can feel when it's finally undeniable. I thanked her, left the store, and sat in my car for nearly an hour. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just thought about how far he'd gone to hide this, the lies, the secrecy, the quiet audacity. And for what? To play father again in the twilight of his life. Or to feed a fantasy that made him feel alive while I stood quietly fading beside him. That evening he came home late. His tie was loose, his shirt creased, his face drawn. I watched him pour a drink, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't look triumphant. He looked afraid. He muttered something about a business problem, about stress, about how people depended on him. He didn't meet my eyes once. After he went to bed, I searched his briefcase again. Inside, among papers and receipts, I found a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note in looping letters, young and impulsive. We need to talk before it's too late. Beneath it, an appointment time and a clinic address. That was the moment everything clicked into place. The vitamins, the fear, the sudden withdrawals from our joint account. He wasn't helping a woman start a new life. He was trying to hide one or end one. The thought made my stomach turn. Not because of what he'd done to me, but because of what he might be doing to someone else. I didn't know the truth yet, whether she was truly pregnant, or whether he'd simply fallen for a trap of his own making, but I knew I would find out. For the first time in years, I felt awake. Clear, I wasn't the naive wife he thought he'd betrayed. I was the woman who had spent her life cataloging facts, building patterns, noticing the smallest details, and he had just given me a mystery to solve. So I began to plan, not for confrontation, not yet, for understanding, for evidence, for the kind of truth that would strip him of every defense he thought he had. He was playing a dangerous game with secrets and guilt. He thought he was in control, but what he didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that I had already started playing too. The clinic sat on the far edge of town, a squat brick building surrounded by an empty parking lot and an overgrown hedge that hid most of it from view. The kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it, which I was. I drove there on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind that smelled of rain and exhaust, my hands steady on the wheel. I told no one where I was going, not that anyone would have asked. At my age, people assume your errands are harmless: grocery runs, doctor visits, coffee with old friends. They never imagine you're following the ghost of your husband's lies. The sign by the door said Windsor Women's Health Center. I parked a few spaces away, low enough to see the entrance but far enough not to be noticed. I sat there for nearly an hour watching people come and go. Young women mostly, a few couples, a man waiting in a car with the engine idling. The minutes stretched, heavy with the weight of what I was doing, or maybe with the weight of finally doing something. At exactly 11:20 I saw him. Richard, the same tan coat, the same restless hands tugging at his collar. He looked smaller from a distance, hunched, uncertain. And beside him was a woman, maybe 30, maybe younger, long hair, nervous posture. She held her stomach as they walked, but I couldn't tell if it was instinct or performance. I felt no shock, no rage, just confirmation. The image of them together was almost ordinary. A man comforting a woman, a lie walking beside its maker. They went inside. I waited. My pulse stayed calm, my breath even. When they came out 40 minutes later, neither spoke. He opened the door for her, she stepped in, and they drove away in his car, the same car that had carried me to weddings, funerals, vacations, years of living. I followed at a distance, not to confront them. I wasn't ready for that. I just wanted to see how far his guilt would drive him. They stopped near the edge of the lake, a quiet spot people used for picnics in summer. He got out first, pacing near the water, running his hands through his hair. She stayed in the car, her face turned away. After a few minutes, he returned, gesturing wildly, his voice sharp even through the closed windows. She shook her head. He slammed the door and drove off, leaving her there. I didn't follow him this time. I waited. Eventually, she pulled out her phone, wiping her face with her sleeve, then drove away in the opposite direction. I caught her license plate number before she disappeared. That night, he came home late again. His shoes left faint marks on the tile. His shirt smelled faintly of her perfume, the same scent I'd found clinging to his jacket weeks ago. He looked exhausted. I asked how his day was. He said, fine. The lie was so simple it almost made me laugh. After he went to bed, I searched online using the plate number. It didn't take long. The woman's name was Sophie Calder, 29 years old, a part-time receptionist at a dental office 2 towns over. Unmarried, no children. Nothing about her suggested the kind of woman who would knowingly ruin another's life. Which left me with 2 possibilities. Either she believed his promises or she had found a way to make him pay for them. I began piecing together the puzzle. The withdrawals, the fear, the late nights. It wasn't guilt alone, it was desperation. He was paying her for silence, for a story that might not even be real. But the real question, the one that burned in the quiet hours, was whether the pregnancy existed at all. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark, listening to the rhythm of his breathing beside me, wondering how many lies a man could tell before he forgot what truth sounded like. By morning, I had made a decision. If he could live 2 lives without blinking, then so could I. I opened a new notebook, not the one in my sewing drawer, but a smaller one I could carry everywhere. I wrote 3 words at the top of the first page. He believes her. Below it, I began to list everything I needed to confirm: names, dates, locations, transactions. The librarian in me resurfaced, patient and precise. Information had always been my craft, and now it would become my weapon. Because if Sophie was lying, I would find out. And if she wasn't, then the man sleeping under my roof had done something even worse than betrayal. He had built a world on deception and dragged me into its shadow. Either way, the truth would be mine, and when I finally decided to use it, he would never see it coming. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring out the window as the rain streaked down the glass. Richard had already left for work, or whatever he called those long absences now. The house was too quiet, filled with the kind of stillness that only comes when lies have settled in like dust, invisible but everywhere. I opened my notebook again, the one that had become my secret ledger. Each page carried the weight of a truth I hadn't spoken aloud. Names, dates, subtle observations, all written neatly, like catalog cards from my old life at the library. I wrote Sophie's name again and again, letting the letters sink into the paper until they felt real. There was a time when I might have blamed her, when I would have imagined her as some scheming, selfish thing who saw my husband's weakness and decided to exploit it. But as I watched her that day at the clinic, something inside me shifted. She didn't look like a seductress or a manipulator. She looked frightened, cornered. And if there was one thing I knew well after 40 years of marriage to Richard, it was how fear could wear a person down until they stopped recognizing themselves. I decided to visit her town that afternoon. I told myself it was just to see where she worked, to get a sense of who she was, but deep down I knew it was more than curiosity. It was the quiet beginning of something larger, something deliberate. The drive was an hour each way, long enough for doubts to rise and fall in waves. I found her office easily, a small, modest dental clinic near a grocery store. I parked across the street and waited, pretending to read while watching the front door through the reflection in my windshield. At around 3 o'clock she came out. No makeup, simple clothes, tired posture. She didn't see me. She walked to an older car, her hands trembling slightly as she searched for her keys. I noticed the grocery bag in her passenger seat, bread, milk, and something small wrapped in brown paper. There was no sign of luxury. No gold jewelry, no expensive handbag, no trace of a woman being spoiled by secret money. So if Richard had been giving her cash, it wasn't for pleasure. It was for something else, something she needed more than comfort. When she drove away, I followed her at a distance. Her apartment was in a faded complex near the railway tracks, the kind of place where the air always smelled faintly of iron and damp concrete. Curtains drawn, no plants on the balcony. A small life quietly lived. I didn't approach her, not that day. I just needed to see her world, to understand what kind of storm my husband had stepped into. Back home, Richard returned late again. He looked exhausted, as though guilt had begun to weigh on him. When he kissed my cheek, his lips barely brushed the skin, an empty ritual. He went upstairs without a word. I stayed in the kitchen, the sound of the rain tapping against the windows like a metronome for my thoughts. Later that night, when he was asleep, I checked his phone. I'd never done it before. I used to think it was beneath me, something desperate people did. But that night I was past shame. His messages were mostly work-related, but one number appeared repeatedly, saved under the name Tom C. Tom, I thought, his accountant. The one he'd mentioned when he explained the financial pressures that required those late-night meetings. I opened the thread and read. The language wasn't personal, not romantic, but the urgency was clear. "We can't keep this up much longer. She's asking again. I told you I'd take care of it. Stop panicking. You promised she'd stay quiet." The last message came from Richard, timestamped the night before. Sophie, it wasn't about love. It wasn't about betrayal in the way I first imagined. It was about something else entirely, something hidden, possibly dangerous. The next morning I went back to the bank. The same clerk, the same polite smile. I asked for a statement going back 12 months this time. There they were, transfers to an account under a different name every 2 weeks, consistent amounts. Not large enough to draw attention, but enough to sustain someone barely holding on. The name was Sophie's. It was an older woman, Marion Calder, her mother. That was the moment the puzzle shifted in my hands, and I began to see the edges of a truth Richard had buried deep. Sophie wasn't just someone he was seeing. She was someone he owed, and that kind of debt, the kind that hides behind money and silence, was the most dangerous of all. I closed the notebook and set my pen down carefully. My hands no longer trembled. I knew now that I wasn't chasing a mistress. I was chasing a secret my husband had spent years keeping from me, and I had no intention of stopping until I unearthed every piece of it. The truth, I've learned, never arrives in a single moment. It seeps in slowly, like water through a crack, until everything you thought was solid begins to give way beneath you. The morning after I discovered the name Marion Calder, I couldn't eat. I couldn't even bring myself to sit still. My body moved on instinct, making tea, washing dishes, rearranging the same 3 objects on the counter, anything to quiet the storm rising in my chest. I searched the name online. Marion Calder, 63, listed at the same address as Sophie, a widow. No employment listed. An old court record, a medical negligence claim from nearly 8 years ago. My heart thudded as I read through the details. Her husband had died in a private clinic following a routine surgery. The case was dismissed after the clinic reached a confidential settlement, and that clinic's director, the signature on the documents, was Dr. Richard Langley, my husband. For a long time I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just betrayal now. It was history folding in on itself, a past he had locked away, one that had quietly followed him home. I remembered that year clearly. He had been distant, agitated, prone to sudden fits of temper. He said it was stress, that the hospital board was pushing him, that he was thinking of early retirement. I'd believed him. I'd told myself that after a lifetime of hard work, maybe he was simply worn down. I had no idea it was guilt, the kind that never leaves a man alone. Now Sophie's fear made sense. She wasn't a lover, she was a survivor's daughter. And Richard's money wasn't payment for affection, it was hush money. It should have made me feel better to know there hadn't been love between them, but somehow it made it worse. Love, even false love, is still human. What he did was colder, calculated. It wasn't weakness that drove him, it was preservation. He had traded compassion for control. That afternoon, I drove to their apartment again. I didn't plan to confront her. I only wanted to see her, to look her in the eyes and understand what kind of woman could live carrying that kind of pain. She answered the door after I knocked twice. Up close, she looked even younger than I remembered. No makeup, tired eyes, shoulders pulled inward. When she saw me, she froze. I could see the recognition flicker across her face. She knew who I was. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she stepped aside, letting me in with a hesitance that wasn't fear but resignation. Her home was small and tidy, the kind of place where every item had a story. A framed photograph of an older man sat on a shelf beside a candle burned low. Her father, I guessed. We sat across from each other, the silence between us taut but fragile. She didn't ask why I was there, she already knew. I spoke quietly, not accusing, just stating what I had learned, that I knew about the payments, the lawsuit, the clinic. She didn't deny any of it. Her hands shook slightly as she held her cup. She told me her mother had never recovered from what happened. That Richard had visited their house once after the settlement, promising help that never came. That he had called again 2 years ago when he learned her mother was sick and needed care. He said he wanted to make amends. I asked why the secrecy. She said he insisted. He told her that if the hospital board discovered the payments, his career and reputation would be destroyed. He made her promise silence. There it was again, his talent for rewriting guilt as generosity. When I left her apartment, the sun was setting and the street lights had just begun to hum to life. I sat in my car, staring at the sky as the colors faded from gold to bruised gray. I thought of the man sleeping in my bed every night, the man who laughed with our children, who spoke of integrity and honor. And all I could see was the hollow behind his eyes, the part of him that had been empty long before I ever noticed. That night I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I returned to my notebook and drew a single line across the page, separating the first half from the second. Above it I wrote, "Discovery." Below it I wrote, "Reconstruction." The first half of the story was his, the lies, the cowardice, the quiet cruelty. The second half would be mine. He had spent years building a life on deception. I would spend the next months dismantling it, carefully, quietly, and piece by piece, because what he had stolen from those women wasn't money or reputation. It was peace. And that, I decided, I could take back in ways he'd never expect. That night, for the first time in months, I slept soundly. There's a moment after devastation when everything becomes silent. It's not peace, not yet, but a strange kind of clarity. You stop flinching at the memories. You stop asking why. You simply see. That silence came to me a few days after visiting Sophie. I remember standing in my garden that morning, the cold air brushing against my face, the soil damp from last night's rain. The rose bushes needed trimming, and for once I didn't mind the thorns. The small cuts on my fingers felt grounding. Real. I had been living in a fog for so long that even pain felt like a sign of life returning. I thought about Richard and the years I'd spent orbiting his moods, the way I'd learned to read his footsteps, his tone, the small shifts in his breathing. I had spent a lifetime managing him, smoothing the rough edges of his ego, disguising his cruelty with my silence. But that morning, something inside me settled into place. The weight I had carried wasn't mine anymore. It was his. And I was done holding it for him. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. The pages were filled with facts, timelines, details, but for the first time I began to see them not as evidence but as strategy. I wasn't collecting anymore, I was planning. I drew 3 columns across a new page. The first I labeled what he hid, the second who he owes, the third what he fears. Under what he hid, I listed the clinic's negligence case, the hush payments, and the falsified records I suspected he'd used to bury the evidence. Under who he owes, I wrote 2 names, Sophie Calder and Marion Calder. Under what he fears, I wrote only one word, exposure, because that was Richard's true weakness, not guilt, not remorse, but the terror of being seen for what he truly was. That realization was the turning point. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need revenge in the way angry people imagine it, loud, chaotic, final. I needed precision. The kind that dismantles a man's legacy the same way he dismantled trust, quietly, thoroughly, and without warning. For weeks, I played my part perfectly. The loving, aging wife, the one who asked about his day and smiled through his excuses. I even joined him for dinner parties again, nodding along as he spoke about integrity and discipline to his colleagues. He had no idea that each word he spoke became another piece in my growing map of hypocrisy. Meanwhile, I began to build alliances of my own. Old colleagues from the library who now worked in municipal records, a retired nurse who'd been at his clinic years ago, a journalist I once helped with research on an unrelated case, a woman who remembered me kindly. I didn't reveal everything at once, only small, innocuous requests for historical information. People rarely question a widow in waiting, a woman whose husband has grown distant. I learned that the old case involving Sophie's father had been quietly expunged from the hospital archives. The settlement funds had been rerouted through shell accounts under different names, all managed by Richard's former partner, Tom Carlyle. The same man from the messages on his phone. Carlyle had since retired to another state, but his wife, a woman named Linda, was still active in local philanthropy. I attended one of her events, dressed simply, a familiar face among donors. We spoke briefly about her husband's retirement, about how difficult it must be to let go of something after so many years. She smiled, polite but strained. There was tension there, the kind that comes from too many secrets shared in a marriage. I left early that evening, but with a contact number slipped discreetly into my bag. I didn't need to call yet. Just knowing it was there felt like power waiting to be used. That night, as Richard slept beside me, I looked at his face in the dim light, the faint lines, the calmness that came from believing he was still untouchable. I used to love that face. Now it reminded me of every story he'd stolen from others to protect his own. He still thought I was asleep when he slipped out of bed the next morning, heading to his office before sunrise. But I followed him again, not to the clinic this time, but to a small storage unit on the outskirts of town. He went inside for nearly an hour, emerging with a folder tucked under his arm. When he drove away, I waited, then approached the unit myself. I didn't break in, I didn't need to. I noted the number, the lock type, the security company. All details I could use later. By the time I returned home, the plan had taken shape fully in my mind. I wouldn't destroy him in one blow. That would make me no different from him, rash, desperate, unthinking. No. I would let him destroy himself with the truth as the rope. He had spent decades building an image of a moral man, a respected doctor, a faithful husband. All it would take was the right nudge, and that image would collapse under the weight of his own lies. As I closed the notebook, I realized something startling. I wasn't afraid anymore. The first time I called Sophie, my hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected nerves, maybe even guilt, but all I felt was clarity. The kind that comes when the world stops spinning and you finally see the gears underneath. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was soft, cautious, like someone expecting bad news. I told her who I was, though I knew she already knew. I asked to meet her not as my husband's wife, but as a woman who wanted the truth. There was a long pause. Then a quiet agreement. We met the next afternoon at a small cafe by the lake. The kind of place where nobody paid attention to others, where conversations blurred into the background hum of espresso machines and low music. She arrived early, wearing the same gray coat I'd seen before, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. When I joined her, she looked up, startled, then relaxed slightly when she saw that I wasn't angry. We didn't exchange pleasantries. There was no need. I told her I wasn't here to accuse her or to defend him. I wanted to understand. She told me everything. Slowly, hesitantly, like someone peeling away layers of a wound that never healed. After her father's death, her mother's health had declined, physical first, then emotional. The settlement Richard arranged was meant to secure their future, but it had barely covered medical bills. Years later, when her mother's condition worsened, she reached out to the clinic for records that had mysteriously gone missing. Instead, Richard showed up at her door, promising to help. He offered financial support, claiming guilt, regret, redemption, all the right words, but the payments came with control. Silence. She wasn't to speak to lawyers, journalists, or even friends about her father's death. He made it sound like protection, but it was leverage. I listened without interrupting. I didn't need to. The truth was already aligning itself in my mind, neat and deliberate. When she finished, I asked her one question: whether she still had any of the original documents from her father's case. She nodded, said they were safe, hidden in her apartment. I offered to help her, not with money, but with something better: exposure. She hesitated at first. I understood. She had spent years being silenced, controlled by the same man who had ruined her family. It would take time for her to trust that this time was different. So I left her my card and told her that if she ever wanted to make things right, I would stand beside her. By the time I drove home, I knew the next step. That night, while Richard showered, I walked quietly into his study, a room I had dusted for decades but never truly entered. His desk was immaculate, of course, every paper aligned, every pen in its place. But there in the bottom drawer was a keychain I recognized from the storage unit. He had been careless, or maybe too confident. Either way, it was enough. 2 days later, I went back to the unit. I didn't need to force the lock. I had copied the key. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old cardboard. Rows of boxes lined the walls, each labeled by year. I sifted through them until I found the folder I'd seen him carry, thick, worn, the edges yellowed. Inside were files from his clinic, patient records, settlement drafts, letters. And there, the original complaint from the Calder case, complete with medical reports and photographs he had sworn were lost. I didn't take the folder. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I photographed every page, every signature, every false date. My phone became a silent witness. I left everything as I found it, locked the door, and drove home. For the first time in years, I felt something close to exhilaration. Not joy, not yet, but the satisfaction of movement. The feeling of power returning after decades of being diminished. Over the next few weeks, I became invisible again, the quiet wife, the gentle caretaker, the background presence Richard had long stopped noticing. While he entertained guests and took late-night calls, I was building a web. I reached out to the journalist I'd known years ago, a woman named Claire. I told her I had information about an old medical case that had never seen the light of day. I didn't give names, not yet, only enough to spark interest. She asked to meet. I told her soon. I needed time to prepare the story properly to ensure that when it came out there would be no way for him to deny it. Richard, meanwhile, had begun to unravel in small, delicious ways. His temper had grown shorter. He paced more. He started checking his phone constantly, locking his study at night. He sensed something shifting, though he couldn't tell from where. The fortress he'd built was starting to creak. One evening, as we sat at dinner, he asked me if I'd seen anything unusual at the bank. I said no, tilting my head with gentle confusion. He smiled too tightly, then changed the subject. I smiled back. He didn't know that the real cracks weren't in his finances or his reputation, but in the silence he had relied on for years. Because silence, once broken, becomes the loudest sound in the world. And soon he was going to hear it. When Sophie called again, her voice was different, steadier, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has finally decided to stop running. She said she wanted to meet. Not at the cafe this time, somewhere quiet, private. I suggested my house. She hesitated for only a second before agreeing. That afternoon, I brewed tea and set 2 cups on the table by the window. It was the same window I'd stared through countless mornings, wondering what went on inside my husband's head. But today, that question didn't matter anymore. When Sophie arrived, she looked less fragile than before, still nervous but purposeful. There was resolve in her eyes, and it reminded me of myself decades ago, before years of marriage had worn that same resolve down into silence. She brought a folder with her, thick, bulging with papers. I didn't need to ask what it was. She laid it on the table between us, her hands trembling slightly as she pushed it toward me. "These are the originals," she said. Everything he buried. We spent hours going through the documents, medical reports, correspondence, financial records. Every page was another piece of a puzzle I now knew by heart. But seeing it laid bare in black and white turned the abstract into something undeniable. It was all there, the falsified signatures, the falsified test results, the settlements issued under false pretenses. Richard hadn't just hidden a mistake. He had built a new life on its ruins. When we finished, Sophie leaned back, her eyes glassy but calm. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked out the window, at the garden, at the roses beginning to bloom again despite neglect. "I'm going to give him the thing he fears most," I said finally. Visibility. We devised the plan together over the next few days. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was meticulous, cold, simple. I would use my connections, the journalist, the retired nurse, the archivist who still owed me a favor, to make sure the documents reached the right people quietly through back channels that would lead to Claire, the reporter. Sophie would provide her statement, carefully written, factual, restrained. There would be no accusations, no emotion, no words for him to twist, just truth stacked like stones. But before any of that, I wanted Richard to see it coming, to feel the ground shift beneath him, one crack at a time. So I started with small things. Anonymous letters sent to his office, each one containing a single photocopied page from the Calder file. The first was a hospital report. The second, the settlement draft. The third, a copy of his own signature beneath the words, "Liability Resolved, Confidential Agreement." He never said anything about them, but I saw the change immediately. The way he lingered longer in his study, the way he checked the locks twice before bed. His hands shook when he poured his coffee. He began making phone calls in the middle of the night, whispering in the hallway. The arrogance that had once shielded him was cracking. One evening, I heard him on the phone with Tom Carlyle, his voice low, urgent. He said someone must have gotten into the archives. That someone knew. I could hear the panic in his tone, the same panic he had instilled in everyone around him for years. That night, he didn't sleep. And for the first time in my life, I slept soundly knowing he couldn't. A week later, I met with Claire at her office downtown. She was everything I remembered, sharp, curious, and patient enough to let silence do the talking. I told her the truth, that I had discovered evidence of a medical cover-up involving my husband's clinic. I gave her copies of the documents, but I kept Sophie's name out of it, at least for now. She promised confidentiality, saying the story would only move forward once all sources were verified. When I returned home, Richard was in the living room, his face pale, his tie loosened, his phone clutched in his hand. He looked at me, eyes bloodshot, and for a moment I thought he might confess. But he only said he'd had a long day, then went upstairs. I watched him go, realizing how small he'd become. How the man who once towered over everyone with control and confidence was now shrinking under the weight of his own past. Later that night, I opened my notebook again. The columns were nearly full now. What he hid, checked. Who he owes, checked. What he fears, in progress. At the bottom of the page, I wrote a final line. The truth isn't revenge, it's reclamation. Because what I was doing wasn't about punishing him anymore. It was about taking back what he had stolen from Sophie, from her mother, from me. The years of silence, the peace, the dignity. I closed the notebook and placed it on the table beside me. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of the roses. I thought of all the years I had tended them while he lied. And I smiled, realizing something simple and profound, that things grow best in silence only until the light reaches them. It was time for light. The first article dropped on a Monday morning. I woke before dawn, the house still wrapped in that strange, heavy quiet that follows a storm before the world wakes up. The kettle whistled softly as I made tea, and by the time I sat at the table, the headline was already spreading like wildfire across every digital front page. Prominent surgeon under scrutiny for decades-old negligence case. No names were mentioned yet, not officially, but the details were unmistakable to anyone who knew the story. The Calder case. The clinic. The missing records. The journalist Claire had done exactly as promised. Factual, restrained, and surgical in precision. By the time the clock struck 9, my phone was vibrating non-stop. Messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, polite inquiries disguised as concern, curiosity veiled as sympathy. I ignored them all. Upstairs, I heard the sound of pacing. Heavy footsteps, back and forth, over and over, then silence. Then again, Richard didn't come down for breakfast. By noon, his photo was circulating alongside the story. Not officially tied to it yet, but close enough that the connection was inevitable. Every comment thread, every whispered conversation in the hospital corridors, every colleague's uncertain look, they all pointed toward him. That afternoon, the hospital board called an emergency meeting. He left the house without a word, his suit immaculate but his eyes hollow. I watched from the window as he drove away, gripping the steering wheel too tightly. For a moment, I thought of how he used to look leaving for work, confident, composed, untouchable. That man no longer existed. When he returned hours later, he looked deflated. There was no anger, no denial, just a kind of stunned disbelief, as if his mind was struggling to catch up with the reality he had spent years burying. He sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He asked me if I'd seen the news. I said I had. He nodded, looking down at the floor, and said he couldn't understand how this had resurfaced after all this time. There was something almost pitiful in his confusion. He wasn't used to being powerless, and now, stripped of his control, he was unraveling. I wanted to tell him the truth then, that it wasn't fate or bad luck or betrayal that brought him here. It was himself, his choices, his arrogance, his deceit. But I stayed silent. Silence was more powerful. Over the next few days, more reports surfaced. Former patients came forward. Anonymous testimonies appeared online. The story snowballed, unstoppable now. What began as a whisper had become a roar. Sophie called again, her voice trembling not with fear this time but relief. She said she'd finally told her mother everything about her father, about Richard, about what happened all those years ago. Her mother had cried not from anger but from release. She said she'd waited her whole life for someone to tell the truth. That night, as I listened to the rain tapping gently against the windows, I realized the strange irony of it all. For years, Richard had lived like the world owed him silence, that if he was careful enough, powerful enough, the truth would always stay buried. But the truth isn't buried forever. It seeps. Slowly, patiently, until one day it surfaces. By the end of the week, he had been suspended pending investigation. The hospital board released a statement expressing deep concern. His partners distanced themselves. The walls he'd built around his reputation, polished, expensive, impenetrable, were collapsing one after another. And through it all, he never once looked at me the same way again. The arrogance was gone. So was the charm. What remained was something small, frightened, and human. That weekend, I found him sitting alone in the garden, staring at the rose bushes. The same ones I had planted years ago, back when we still believed in beauty and permanence. He asked me how I'd kept them alive all these years. I told him it was simple: you prune what's diseased, no matter how painful, or the whole garden suffers. He didn't respond. But I think for the first time he understood. That night after he went to bed, I opened my notebook one last time. The final line was waiting there, the one I hadn't dared to write before. What he lost, everything that was never truly his to begin with. I closed the book and placed it on the shelf between the old case files and my father's journals. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like balance. For years, Richard Ward had believed that truth was a matter of control, that if he hid it well enough, it would obey him. But truth doesn't obey. It simply waits, and when it finally speaks, it doesn't whisper. It thunders. The investigation stretched on for months. Every week brought a new revelation, a new headline, a new quiet humiliation that Richard tried and failed to conceal. He stopped going to the hospital altogether. His once flawless posture gave way to a slow, uncertain shuffle. The neighbors pretended not to notice the change, but in a town this small, silence was only another form of gossip. Cars slowed when they passed our house. The same people who once invited us to dinner now looked away when they saw me at the market. I didn't mind. Their distance was a kind of peace. When the official report finally came out, it was devastating. The negligence case had been suppressed through forged documentation and hush payments, all signed by Richard himself. The hospital board had no choice but to terminate his position permanently and refer the matter to the licensing authority. He tried to fight it, of course. He hired lawyers, called in favors, made desperate promises to old allies. But they all withdrew, one by one, unwilling to tie themselves to a sinking name. I watched him unravel without satisfaction, only understanding. You can't destroy someone who has already hollowed himself out. One morning I found him sitting at the dining table, staring at a stack of letters, formal, final, unmistakable. He said only that it was over, that his name meant nothing now. He sounded tired, not angry. For the first time in decades, he was simply human. After that, he left the house often, though never for long. Sometimes I'd see him standing near the park as if waiting for something. Other times, sitting alone by the church steps. He had spent so much of his life performing control that when it was gone, he didn't know who he was without it. Sophie came to visit that spring. She was different, lighter somehow. She'd been seeing her mother regularly, helping her rebuild the little bakery they once dreamed of running together. There was a quiet strength in her now, something that had taken root in the ruins. We sat in the garden, drinking tea while the wind carried the scent of roses. She asked if I ever regretted what I'd done. I told her regret is only for those who still wish to return to the past. I no longer did. The days grew softer after that. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since before I married. It felt strange at first, holding the brush, the way colors bled into one another like time itself, but it also felt right. There was no more noise, no more calculation, only stillness. One evening, as the light faded into a deep amber, I received a letter. It was from the hospital, not for Richard, but for me. They wanted to formally thank me for providing the archived files that helped uncover the truth. I hadn't told anyone I'd kept those documents all these years tucked away in my father's old study, long before I even knew I'd need them. It wasn't revenge that guided me. It was memory. Richard moved out a few months later. The last thing he took was his watch, the same one I'd given him on our 25th anniversary. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. Sometimes, late at night, I still think of the woman I used to be, the one who believed in forgiveness, in patience, in quiet endurance. I don't hate her. She kept me alive long enough to become someone else. The house feels larger now, the silence kinder. The garden thrives more each season, the blooms brighter, wilder, freer. There's an old saying my mother used to whisper when things went wrong: the truth doesn't hurt, it cleans. I never understood it until now. The truth had stripped away everything false, and what remained was something simple, something whole. I am Evelyn Ward. I am 68 years old. I have lost and gained in equal measure. And though the years ahead are fewer than those behind, they are mine in a way none of the others ever were. Sometimes, when the wind moves through the garden just right, I hear a faint echo, the sound of everything that tried to break me fading into distance. And I smile because I finally understand what peace feels like. The end, when it finally came, was quiet. Not dramatic, not public, not filled with the noise of confrontation, just a fading away, the sound of a life unraveling softly. Richard moved into a small apartment on the edge of town. It was near the lake, in a building that once housed junior doctors and nurses decades ago. I knew it because I'd visited that place in another lifetime, back when he was still building his career, and I still believed in his brilliance. He never remarried. Never tried to rebuild the life he'd lost. It was as though he'd accepted that the performance was over, that there was no audience left to impress. Occasionally he sent me letters, polite, stiff, written in that old formal tone of his. They said nothing of regret or apology, just mundane details about the weather, the lake, the swans that nested nearby. I never responded, but I read every one. He was still trying to be seen, even when there was no one left to look at him. Sophie visited him. She told me later that he looked smaller, older than his years, as though all the weight he used to carry in arrogance had collapsed inward. He spoke softly, not about himself, but about her mother, the life he destroyed, the choices that could never be undone. When he died 2 years later, it was sudden, a heart failure, they said. No ceremony, no press, no final headlines. Just a small, quiet funeral attended by a handful of people who once called him friend. Sophie told me there was a calmness in his face, the kind that comes only when there's nothing left to defend. I didn't go to the funeral. I stayed home in the garden tending to the roses. The sun was low and a soft breeze carried the scent of earth and rain. I felt no anger, no sorrow, just a deep, steady stillness. It struck me then, revenge doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like survival. Like waking up every day and realizing the people who tried to erase you are now the ones forgotten. After his death, I received a letter from his lawyer. A final will, brief and impersonal. He had left me everything, the remnants of his estate, what little was left after the lawsuits and debts. I declined it all. I asked that it be donated to the foundation for patients affected by medical negligence. It was never about reclaiming what he owed. It was about restoring balance to the world he distorted. The weeks that followed felt strange, like stepping into a new life wearing an old name. I found myself walking through the town more often, to the bakery Sophie helped reopen, to the library where I used to read with my children, to the shore where the light turned gold at dusk. People still whispered when they saw me, but there was no pity left in their voices now. Just something else, a quiet respect, maybe even admiration. They no longer saw the fragile wife of a fallen man. They saw someone who had endured and stayed whole. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the stars appear, I thought of the years I'd spent shrinking myself to fit the shape of someone else's comfort. I thought of the patience that was mistaken for weakness, of the loyalty that was used against me, and I realized the truth: I was never naive. I was waiting for time to catch up to what I already knew. That justice, in its purest form, isn't loud or cruel. It's patient. It waits in silence like the tide until the world turns back in its favor. When I went to bed that night, I left the window open. The air was cool, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the faint rhythm of crickets. Life, indifferent yet kind, went on. Richard's story had ended. Mine, for the first time, felt like it was only beginning. The morning light felt different now. It no longer slipped through the curtains like an intruder. It arrived gently, as if it knew it was welcome again. I started waking up earlier, not because of habit, but because I wanted to. The air tasted like something new, something unburdened. It had been a year since Richard's passing. The town had already moved on, as towns always do. New gossip, new faces, new stories to replace the old. The silence that once followed me like a shadow had softened into a kind of peace. The house, my house now, had transformed too. The walls that used to echo with unspoken words were warm again. I'd repainted the rooms in shades of cream and green, calm, living colors. I'd turned his old study into a reading nook, lined with plants and sunlight. The shelves that once held medical journals now held art books and poetry. Every morning I took my tea to the garden. The roses bloomed wildly that spring, untamed, unapologetic. I never pruned them anymore. I let them grow as they pleased, as if to remind me that beauty doesn't need permission to exist. Sophie came by often. We had developed something unexpected, not just friendship, but kinship. Her mother sometimes joined us too, and though the first few visits were quiet and tentative, laughter eventually returned. It was strange how easily forgiveness took root once the truth had room to breathe. One afternoon, Sophie brought me a gift, a small notebook with a linen cover. Inside, she had written one sentence on the first page: "For the stories that deserve to be told." I didn't realize until that moment how many stories I'd been carrying, stories of women like me, who had spent their lives in the shadows of men they thought they knew. Women who endured in silence because the world taught them endurance was their only virtue. That night I began to write. Not for publication, not for recognition, but to remember. To give voice to all the quiet strength that had gone unnoticed. The words came easily, like water finding its path after years of drought. Sometimes I wonder what Richard would think if he could see me now. Not the version of me he believed in, subdued, careful, ornamental, but the one who survived him. I think he'd be surprised, maybe even proud in his strange way. But mostly I think he'd finally understand what he'd spent a lifetime overlooking, that the softest things can endure the longest. As the months passed, I began volunteering at a women's center in town, helping others navigate the slow, painful path back to themselves. I never spoke of my own story. I didn't need to. They saw it in me, the quiet steadiness, the way my voice no longer trembled when I spoke. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I stood in my garden and looked at the horizon. The sky was brushed in gold and violet, the kind of color that made everything feel possible again. I thought about all the years I'd spent waiting for peace, for justice, for the world to right itself. And I realized I didn't need to wait anymore. Peace wasn't something given. It was something reclaimed, moment by moment, breath by breath. As I turned to go inside, I caught my reflection in the window, older, yes, but lighter. There was no bitterness left in my eyes, only clarity. This, I thought, is what freedom feels like. Not loud, not triumphant, but quiet, grounded, inevitable. I lit a candle on the table, sat down with my notebook, and began to write again. This time not about pain, but about what comes after. About how even in the ruins of betrayal, life grows back in unexpected ways. And as the candle flickered, I wrote the last line I would ever need. I was never his shadow. I was the light he couldn't see. Then I closed the book, let the silence settle around me, and smiled, because this was my dawn, and it was finally mine.